It's Passover, or Pesach. Today I'm going to be talking to you about some of the basics of this holiday, what makes it important to the Jewish people, and what makes it important to people like you and me. Are you ready? Let's go. Now, out of all of the Lord's feasts, as mentioned in the Bible, Passover is perhaps one of the more well-known ones. If you're unfamiliar with the story, I'm going to give a little bit of a recap right now, but I encourage you to go read it yourself. Now, if you remember at the end of Genesis, the Israelites find themselves in the land of Egypt. They've gone there to be reunited with Joseph. It's a very moving moment. They are given land in the land of Goshen, so they are able to bring their families there and have a good life. Now, we know from the Bible that they're there for a long time, and eventually a Pharaoh rises up that doesn't know Joseph, that has no idea what Joseph did for Egypt, that conveniently has forgotten that Joseph was so instrumental in delivering them from a terrible famine. When he sees the Israelites, he looks at them and sees, wow, free labor, and turns them all into slaves. Now, the Israelites are slaves in Egypt for about 400 years. Through this, we see the suffering that God's people are going through in this land, but we also see that God has not forgotten them. We know that God hears their cries, and as they cry out to him, he raises up a very special person, a man named Moses and his brother Aaron, and together, through them, God basically reveals himself and all of his power to the land of Egypt and to Pharaoh. With each plague, God shows himself to not just the Egyptians, but to his people, and he brings them through it all until finally Pharaoh tells them to go. And it is a time of rejoicing that God has brought them through this, and now they get to leave this land of idol worship, this land of slavery, this land that is not their home, and they get to go home. Now, if you're familiar with the rest of the story, you know it's not exactly a short, pleasant journey to get back to Canaan, but we see in this moment God's miraculous redemption for his people. He promised Abraham, he told Abraham that this would happen, that his people would be enslaved in another land. But he also said in that moment that he would redeem them and bring them home. And that is an amazing, amazing thing to remember. Which is why we have the holiday of Passover, or Pesach. It is about remembering what God did to deliver his people. And in a greater sense, it's a reminder for all of us that God has ultimately delivered us from our sin, from our Egypt, so to speak. You may have noticed a lot of these holidays are about remembering, or about redemption, or about salvation. And that's very important, because all of these holidays in their own way point toward the ultimate salvation, point to the ultimate redemption of all mankind. They all point to Jesus, or Yeshua. Now, as you can imagine, because this is such a momentous occasion for the Israelites, it becomes important for them to realize that this was not done by their own might or by their own strength. It wasn't that Moses had a silver tongue, as they say in English, and was able to charm Pharaoh into letting them go. At the end of the day, it was all because of God. It was by God's grace, by God's power, and because God is always faithful to his people, and he is faithful to his promises. And so the Israelites, even before they leave Egypt, they are told by God that they need to remember this every year, every generation, forever. For example, in Exodus 12:14 it says, "This is the day you are to commemorate. For the generations to come you shall celebrate it as a festival to the Lord, a lasting ordinance." God knows us. He knows us very well. And let's be real, we need the reminders. So how do Jewish people celebrate Pesach? Let's start with the basics and then kind of move into sort of some of the traditions that have been added on as time has gone by. One of the most basic things, no yeast. You cannot have yeast in your house, in your food, on your person, hidden in a cabinet. All of the yeast needs to go. Today, Jewish people sometimes treat it like spring cleaning. Since you're getting rid of all the yeast in your house, it's a good opportunity to clean everything, to make sure you're very thorough in getting all the yeast out. One year I was in Jerusalem right before Pesach, which is about the time people start cleaning everything. And I watched as this Jewish couple dragged their refrigerator, the whole refrigerator, onto their balcony so that they could hose it down, just to make sure they got all the nooks and crannies and there weren't any breadcrumbs hiding there. And I was completely amazed because I usually just, get the bread out and the yeast out and that's about it. So that gives you an idea of how important it is to the Jewish people to really thoroughly remove all trace of yeast from their house. In fact, there is even a special ceremony that they do, a fun family activity the night before Passover called Bedikat Chametz, which basically means the search for leaven. Leaven is another word for yeast. Now at this point, because it's the night before Passover, hopefully your house is completely clean already. You've already thrown out or relocated your yeast and bread to somewhere else. Basically, the leader of the house will reserve maybe like a slice of bread, a couple crackers, some crumbs, and hide them strategically in the house. Then, for the ceremony, they turn off all the lights, so they're gonna use candlelight so you get to hold candles. And then you have a paper bag. So the paper bag is to contain all of the remaining bits of leaven that you find in your house. And then the kids and the adults, they have a feather and a spoon. The feather is for the crumbs, so like a brush. You get to brush the crumbs into the paper bag, or you have a spoon for the larger pieces to spoon them into the bag. And then that bag is basically sealed up and then traditionally burned in the morning. There are even special blessings that they say at the beginning of this ceremony and at the end of it that basically translate to, I have searched my house for leaven, for yeast, I have removed all that I can find. If there happens to be some that I missed or am unaware of, I renounce ownership of it. It is not mine. I am right before God and ready for Passover. Also, the Bible says during the festival of Pesach, you are to do no work other than food preparation. So it's another one of those holidays that revolves around food and celebrating with food. And as a result, there's a lot of very delicious recipes out there because even though you can't have yeast, you still can have a whole lot of other stuff, and it's all very good. Now, modern Passover is actually a combination of 3 holidays mentioned in the Bible. It's a combination of the festival of Passover, the festival of unleavened bread, and the Feast of First Fruits. So that makes up the 8 days of Passover. Now, usually on the first night of Passover, there's a very special ceremony. Most Jewish holidays, you may have noticed, involve some kind of ceremony, and it's to help mark that this is a very special and holy occasion. This particular ceremony for Passover, some of you may be familiar with it. It's called a Seder. Seder means order. And through this Seder, the Jewish people remember what God did to deliver them out of Egypt. Now, before I continue, I'm going to do a little bit of a detour and help you set up your very own Seder plate. That way, when Pesach rolls around this year or another time, you'll be able to have your own Seder plate and celebrate as well. Originally, the Passover Seder was very close to what is mentioned in the book of Exodus, in which case there were only 3 main elements on the table. For example, the first one is a lamb, a Passover lamb. Today, a lot of Jews do not eat lamb on Passover. This has to do with the fact that there's no temple, so there's no way to do a temple sacrifice. So a lot of them just leave lamb off the table in the hopes that someday it will return to the Passover table when the temple is rebuilt and they can actually have a sacrifice. You're also going to have bitter herbs. This is another original element from the traditional table. Now, of course, it's not Passover without matzah. Now, what is matzah? This is matzah. Matzah is unleavened bread, and in this case, it kind of definitely looks like a cracker. Originally, matzah was made in homes. When mass production showed up in history, again, I love history, this becomes something that is very quickly mass-produced for the Jewish community so that everyone can get kosher for Passover matzah. Obviously, you're going to want to have enough matzah to last your Seder, but if you're doing Passover right and not eating anything with yeast for the next 8 days, you're probably going to want to stock up on these. They're actually quite tasteless, so that means you can do a lot of stuff with them, You can make them savory, you can make them sweet. Now, just as a side note, some Jewish people do take this a step further to make sure they don't even have anything in the house that resembles yeast or anything that will create the effect of yeast. So some Jewish people will not use baking powder, baking soda, and they'll even avoid certain grains or fermented items. But as for me, I kind of like to go back to the Bible, and I think no yeast is enough. But it's up to you. Now, as I mentioned, the original Seder plate would have been just lamb, bitter herbs, and matzah. If you've ever been to a Passover Seder or just Googled a Seder plate, you'll notice that there's more than 3 items on the plate today. So the modern Seder plate is going to definitely look different than what the Israelites in the Bible would have seen. But everything on there has meaning, so we're going to go through it. So even though lamb itself probably won't be present on a Passover table today, on your Seder plate you will have a lamb shank bone. This is called zeroah, and this is to represent the lamb that was sacrificed at Passover. On your plate you're also going to have a roasted hard-boiled egg. This is called beitza, and it is meant to symbolize the burnt offerings in the temple. The best way to roast your egg is to make sure it's hard-boiled in water first. If you try to roast a raw egg, it may explode on you. But if you hard boil it first, it can withstand the heat. So at that point, once it's hard boiled, you can either hold it over an open flame until it gets some nice charring or cracking, or you can put it in your oven. You're also going to want to have bitter herbs on your plate because that's something that hasn't gone away. This is called maror. Traditionally, it is done by having a little piece of horseradish root on your Seder plate. I personally have never been able to find a horseradish root, so I usually end up getting the pre-grated horseradish or the creamed horseradish that you get in the jar at the store. Maror is meant to symbolize the bitterness of slavery. For your Seder, you're also going to want to prepare some haroset. Haroset is basically a sweet apple nut mixture. Everything is chopped up really finely. You add some spices, you add honey, you add brown sugar, you maybe add some wine if you want. Haroset is meant to represent the sweetness of redemption. There are a bunch of different recipes for haroset, but I'm going to share with you a very simple one that I've used every year, and it comes out pretty well, I think. When it comes to making haroset, the portion that I make is perfect for my family. If you really enjoy this mixture, you can definitely double the recipe or triple the recipe. You're going to need 1 apple. I usually go for one of the apples that has a firmer, crunchier texture. 1/4 cups of finely chopped walnuts. Add about ½ a tablespoon of raw honey and a little bit of cinnamon, nutmeg, and clove. About 1/4 of a tablespoon of sweet wine. Brown sugar. You don't have to add a lot because we already have honey, but a little bit of brown sugar helps deepen the flavor a bit. When you're done combining, you're going to cover it and put it in the fridge for at least an hour. So this is something that you want to do before your Seder, and in fact I've done it the day before a Seder and it's been fine. And here's the haroset that we made. It smells really, really good. I just took it out of the fridge, so I'm going to put it on the side because I'm going to show you how to set up a Seder plate in just a moment. So the last thing that's going to end up on your Seder plate is some sort of green vegetable. This is called karpas. So you're going to want to have something like parsley or lettuce or even celery on your Seder plate. And this is supposed to represent life. Because at the end of the day, God delivered his people out of Egypt, out of slavery, and brought them into new life and a new covenant with him. And that is a beautiful thing, and that is definitely something we want to remember on Pesach. So now that we know all the items that go on the Seder plate, let's set it up for real. So this is a Seder plate. As you can tell, there's 6 different sections for all of the items that we're going to put on it. This is one that my mom brought back from Israel, but I've seen all kinds of designs, all kinds of sizes. I've even seen ones that people made themselves. So as long as you have a plate that is special and set aside, because everything about Passover is all about being holy and set aside, you're good to go. So this is the plate that we're going to be using. Now I'm ready to set up the Seder plate.
The sixth space is sometimes reserved for a bitter vegetable, such as romaine lettuce. This is called hazeret.
So here I have my Seder plate. It's all set up for when I'm ready to have my Seder at Passover dinner. On this side, I have my matzah in its little matzah container. This was a gift to me from a friend of mine, and we've used it every year since. Now, before you start thinking we're ready for the Seder, hang on. There's still some things that we're gonna add. You're also going to need some salt water. This represents the tears that the Israelites shed in bondage, and it's part of the ceremony, so you're gonna wanna have that ready. You're also going to need a bowl of clean water for your guests or your family to wash their hands in. A couple of times in the Seder, you're going to be called upon to wash your hands, and this represents a ceremonial cleaning before you approach God. So again, we're setting apart Passover as a very special time of communion with God. So you're going to want to have that bowl of water ready, plus a towel for people to dry their hands on. You're also going to need 2 pouches for your matzah. Your matzah, again, plays a very important role during the Seder. This is not the same as the matzah that we've set aside to eat.
This large matzah pouch has 3 sections in it. In each section, you will be placing 1 full sheet of matzah. At some point during the Seder ceremony, the middle matzah is removed, broken in half, and one of the halves is then placed into a smaller pouch. This is called the Afikomen.
And then an adult will go hide it in the house somewhere. And after the dinner, about when you're wrapping things up, the children will go and see who can find the Afikomen. And if they find it, traditionally they are given some sort of prize or candy. The word Afikomen, some say, is Greek, in which case it means that which comes after. If it's Aramaic, it could just mean dessert. So that's why it happens after the meal. Also during the Seder, you're going to be drinking 4 cups of wine or grape juice. In my family, we don't tend to fill the cup all the way because that's a lot of wine or grape juice. Now the reason there are 4 cups during the Passover Seder is because the ancient rabbis based this on God's promises to Israel in Exodus 6 through 7. Therefore say to the Israelites, I am the Lord, and I will bring you out from under the yoke of the Egyptians. I will free you from being slaves to them, and I will redeem you with an outstretched arm and with mighty acts of judgment. I will take you as my own people, and I will be your God. Then you will know that I am the Lord your God, who brought you out from under the yoke of the Egyptians. That is a very powerful set of promises. Now each of the 4 cups has a specific name, and each name has a specific significance. The first cup is the cup of sanctification. If you know what sanctification means, it means to make something holy. And so we drink it at the start of the Seder to set apart the time of the Seder as special and holy before God. The second cup is called the cup of plagues. It is meant to remember the innocent people in Egypt who suffered from the plagues because of Pharaoh's stubbornness. It's a special moment in the Seder where you dip your finger into your grape juice or your wine and you put 1 drop on the napkin for each of the 10 plagues. And it's a beautiful moment because it's remembering the pain and suffering of others even as you are rejoicing in your redemption and your salvation. The third cup is called the Cup of Redemption. It is a memorial cup, which means it is meant for the remembrance of what God did to redeem his people. The fourth cup is called the Cup of Praise, and it's meant to remind us that this is a time of praise, a time to rejoice in God's redemption and his salvation. Messianic Jews, that means Jews who believe that Jesus or Yeshua is their Messiah, sometimes call this the cup of restoration. And they believe that this cup is what Yeshua refers to when he says, I tell you, I will not drink from this fruit of the vine from now on until that day when I drink it new with you in my Father's kingdom, in Matthew 26:29. You may have noticed this cup behind me, and this is the cup that my family uses for Elijah, which again is not really one of the traditional elements of the Seder, but it was added later. and it's meant for Elijah. Some families will even set up a place at their table for Elijah, and part of the Seder involves opening the door and going, "Hey Elijah, are you out there? You want to come in?" And this comes from Malachi 3:23. In Malachi 3:23 it says that the coming of Elijah will be a precursor to the coming of the Messiah. Now, we know that Jews today are still waiting for their Messiah, but we know that the Messiah, Yeshua, has come already. So for us, having this cup at our table is less about waiting for Elijah, but more about remembering that our Messiah, Yeshua, is coming again, and we are waiting for him. Now, I'm sure at this point some of you might feel like your head's spinning a little bit. You're thinking, wow, this is a lot. There are a lot of things that I have to prepare. There are a lot of things that I need to get. There's a lot of elements. How do I remember this? When do I wash my hands? Don't worry. Now, if you do this every year, maybe you'll be able to do it from memory, but most people use something called a Haggadah. Now, a Haggadah is basically a book. This was a gift to me from a dear friend. And in this book, it basically tells you what you're supposed to do. The order of events, when do you eat this, when do you drink that, when do you wash your hands, what are the songs that you sing, when do we eat the meal, when do we find the Afikomen. All of that is in this Haggadah. Now, if you don't have access to a Haggadah, there's a lot online. I prefer to use Messianic Haggadahs because they very clearly show the connection between Yeshua and Pesach. There's a website online called Hebrew for Christians. I know they have a PDF Haggadah that you can download. I know there's a lot of other websites that have Haggadahs. I think Hefzibah Global Ministry also has a Haggadah in Chinese if you need it. But basically, this is very useful if you plan on having a Seder of your own, and I highly recommend getting one or getting access to one. Like the other holidays that we've talked about, again, we have a theme of salvation and redemption. So in the story of Exodus, we not only see God's plan for his people, the Israelites, his plan of redeeming them from Egypt and from slavery, we can also see a shadow of something greater, a hint at the greater plan of redemption that God has for the entire world. Now, in the story of Exodus, Egypt is represented as a place of sin and suffering and slavery. We know that the Egyptians worshipped many gods. We know that they were cruel taskmasters to the Israelites. And we see in that example a reflection of our slavery to sin before we know Yeshua. That slavery to our sinful nature, that if I want something, if I want to do something, even if it hurts somebody, as long as it makes me feel good, I'm going to do it, even if it hurts me. That sinful nature is represented here in Egypt. 400 years they were in slavery. They could not save themselves. They needed the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob to step in with his power and his grace and deliver them. No matter how we try, and I know so many of us try, we try to do good things, good deeds, but at the end of the day, we find ourselves falling far, far short from perfection, from even being good enough. We cannot deliver ourselves from slavery to sin. We needed Yeshua to die on the cross, to rise again, for his blood to cover our sin, and for him to redeem us at great price, for us to know true freedom from slavery. Another aspect of the story of Exodus that resonates with us as believers is the fact that they have to remove all the yeast. Now in 1 Corinthians 5, we learn that yeast is also a metaphor for sin. Just like the Israelites didn't have time to put yeast in their bread, and God tells them, in fact, don't do it, just eat unleavened bread and go. We see here that yeast represents that sin in our lives that we need to deal with and get rid of. Now remember, part of the celebration of Passover involves cleaning your house of yeast, yeast products, anything with even yeast extract in it, and just getting it out of the house. And that is representative of what we need to do in our hearts. Not just on Passover, but on a daily basis. We need to search our hearts for any sin that remains, any of our old self that remains, and remove it. It's significant that before Passover begins, before the Seder even begins, that you're supposed to do this act of cleansing. That before you commune with God, before you sit down and you start thinking about all that he has done for you and praising him and praying to him, that you take a moment and purify yourself, just like you purified your home. You can't even leave a little bit behind, because if you do, it'll continue to grow. We know the importance of this idea of cleansing because in the Bible we see in John chapter 2 when Yeshua clears out the temple of all the money changers and the people who are selling things. He does this, it says, right before the festival of Passover. He's angry that they're doing this in the temple courts. And it's a reminder that sin has no place in God's presence. So I, for one, am thankful and full of praise that imperfect sinner that I am, Yeshua loved me enough to say, I'm going to redeem you from slavery. It's gonna be a process, but I'm going to redeem you. When we even look back at the first Passover, let's say, we see elements and moments of great significance. They were significant, of course, to the Israelites because they had a meaning and purpose in that context. But for us looking at it through the context of Yeshua, our Messiah, we should see even greater purpose and a greater message there. For example, that Passover lamb. In 1 Corinthians 5, it says that Yeshua is our perfect Passover lamb. That perfect Passover lamb that God tells the Israelites, bring into your home. And when the time is right, you're going to sacrifice this lamb. And then you're going to paint the blood of the lamb on the doorpost, on the threshold, so that the angel of death will pass over your home and not come in. That is the perfect picture of Yeshua. He was our perfect Passover lamb, one sacrifice for all time, for all people. And by his blood on our hearts over our sin, death has no hold over us. Paul says to live is Christ and to die is gain. Because we have been delivered from the ultimate death. When you live in sin, when you live in slavery to sin, you are spiritually dead. And you cannot revive yourself on your own. You need a Messiah. And praise God that we can see from this that it wasn't a sudden idea that God had to send his son to die for us. That it was something that he had planned from the very, very, very beginning. And we can rejoice that Yeshua dying and his blood covering us wasn't the last word. Death is not the last word. He rises again 3 days later. He rises again to conquer death and to bring life to all people, to everyone who says, yes, I believe. And that at the end of the day is who Yeshua is to us. He is life, he is redemption, he is everything. When you look at the Lord's feasts, you should start seeing parallels. And that should be exciting to you, because these parallels show that God had a plan, and he always had a plan. There's nothing that God has done that has been without meaning, without purpose, without significance. Everything that he has done and everything that he has set up is pointing at Yeshua, is pointing at the Messiah, is pointing at that moment of restoration. Passover also serves as a reminder that it is important for us as believers to set aside time to have personal communion with God. Pesach reminds us that you need to cleanse yourself, that you need to prepare your heart. Because this is a holy moment. You are going before a holy God. You see the people in the Bible, when they go before God, they take off their sandals, they're face down on the ground, they're thinking, oh no, I'm gonna die. Because our God is holy. He loves us, it's true. He has saved us, it's true. But he is still holy and righteous and far beyond anything we can imagine. So when we go before him, there should be an element of preparation, that we purify ourselves, that we confess, that we search our hearts, so that there's no trace of yeast or sin within us. It's amazing to think that God wanted to be with us so much, that he wanted to restore this relationship so much that he came to die for us. And that he knew he was going to do this from the very beginning. In Revelations 5:12, it says, worthy is the Lamb who was slain to receive power and wealth and wisdom and strength and honor and glory and praise. And not only is he the Lamb that was slain, he is our Savior that rose again and lives now, interceding for us. We should not let anything come between us and a God that loves us like that. You are precious to him. I hope you see that. His plan to redeem you has been set since the beginning of time. And as I wrap this up, I want to remind you all that it's by grace. It's not something we did on our own. It's not something we can do on our own. It is all by his grace. And as we claim that redemption, as we claim salvation and we cling to him, and as we actively strive to rid our lives of sin, even when it's not Passover, grace covers us through it all and lifts us even when we stumble. We're not holy and perfect and complete yet, but we're working towards it, and God is with us every step of the way. And just like he has never abandoned his chosen people or broken one of his promises to them, he does the same for us. So when it comes to celebrating Pesach, it becomes a beautiful opportunity for us to also remember all the ways that God has delivered us from sin, all the ways that he has sustained us through hard times. And it reminds us to go back to our first love, to remember all that we've gone through up until this point, and to give thanks, because he has never abandoned us and he has saved and redeemed us. And you know what? His plan isn't over. This isn't the end. We're still waiting. We're waiting for him to come back. So as we wait, it's important to continually search our hearts, to prepare our hearts, to spend time with him, and to live lives of love and kindness and faith wherever we go. Because you are a walking testimony to how great God is, to all he has done, and his heart for the people of this world. Like I said earlier, Passover is all about good food and celebrating with food, as long as there's no yeast involved. So today I'm going to be sharing with you how to make matzo ball soup. Now, matzo ball soup isn't only eaten during Passover. In fact, it's usually served all year round whenever you like. It has the nickname of Jewish penicillin, and I can personally testify it's great whenever you want it, even outside of Passover. But the reason that it's associated with Passover is because you're going to use matzah meal, which is basically ground up matzah. When you have to eat matzah for 8 days, trust me, people get creative. They will pulverize it into matzah flour to make cake. I've seen people layer it and soak it in heavy cream to make lasagna. I've seen people mix it with some eggs and fry it. I've seen people turn it into pizza. I've done this myself. It's great. Little tomato sauce, little cheese, little whatever topping you want. Toast it and you have pizza. I've seen people also do a dessert version where they'll cover it in like chocolate sauce and berries and nuts and whatever sweet thing they like. So matzah itself has a lot of room for creativity, but today we're just going to make some matzo ball soup. So the base of a matzo ball soup can be a chicken broth or a vegetable broth. I prefer to use chicken broth just because it feels a little bit heartier. You can build the soup as you like. I've seen people just open a can of chicken broth and just use that. I've seen people stick a whole chicken in a bunch of water. For me personally, I'm going to use some kosher organic chicken. I'm gonna add some salt and pepper, some herbs. I'm going to cover it with water. So I'm gonna boil that for a while until the chicken is nice and tender. Once the chicken has been cooking for a while and I'm sure it's done, I'm going to pull the pieces out of the broth. Using my hands, after I've let the chicken cool a bit, you're going to peel off the meat. This way you can throw the bones away and just put the meat back into the pot. At this point, I'm going to add some of the vegetables that I chopped earlier. I'm going for a very traditional Western style chicken soup, in which case we're gonna have a lot of carrots, celery, onion, potatoes, and herbs like parsley and dill. So I've added a little bit more water, so now I'm going to bring it back to a boil, and I'm going to prepare the matzo balls. To make your matzo balls, you're going to need 1/2 cup of matzo meal, 2 eggs, 2 tablespoons of oil, about ½ teaspoon to 1 teaspoon of salt, ½ teaspoon of baking powder, 2 tablespoons of broth, 1 tablespoon of chopped dill. You can also add some garlic powder or onion powder if you like. So we're about ready to make our matzah balls. It's not very difficult at all. Just a couple things to remember. You don't want to overmix. If you overmix the matzah ball mixture, it could become tough. Also, you're going to need to let them rest in the fridge for like 20 to 30 minutes after you've combined everything. I know that sounds like a long time, which is probably why sometimes people will start making the soup while the matzah ball mixture is chilling in the fridge. So in your bowl, first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to crack my eggs into the bowl and then lightly beat them a little bit before I add anything else. Once your eggs are lightly beaten, you're going to add 2 tablespoons of oil. And then you're going to mix it up again. Now you're going to add your matzah meal, you're going to add your salt, baking powder, some garlic powder, add in your chopped dill if you have it, and we're going to mix it up again. Again, this is the point where you don't want to overmix, so once everything's kind of combined, you're going to want to stop. At this point, you're going to add your broth. And then mix it up again. This is about the consistency that you're looking for. If it seems like it's too watery, you can add a little tiny bit more matzah meal, but you don't want it to be too thick, otherwise your balls will be too dense. All right, now that it's done, I'm going to cover it with a little bit of clear wrap. Now I'm going to put it in the fridge for about 20 to 30 minutes so that it can rest a little and hopefully firm up a little so they're easier to roll. Okay, so it's been about 20 to 30 minutes or so. I'm still boiling my soup because we're going to drop the matzah balls in there while it's boiling. Now what you're going to do is have a plate ready. I've put a little bit of oil on this plate, otherwise the matzah balls have a tendency to stick to everything. And I have a little bit of water here. You're going to want to make sure your hands are nice and damp before you try to roll. You can either do this with water or you can do it with a little bit of oil, but the point is, again, to keep the matzah balls from sticking to your hands. So let's get rolling. You're going to roll them into about this size. I guess it's a little bit smaller than a ping pong ball. We've ended up with about 12 matzah balls. We have our 12 matzah balls right here. They're waiting for the soup to be boiling. They look a bit small right now, but don't worry. Once they've had time to soak up some of the soupy goodness, they will get a little bit bigger and hopefully a little bit fluffier. I just need to wait for the soup to boil, and yeah. In English, there's a saying that a watched pot never boils. I guess we're going to see if that's true. Now that our soup is boiling, we're going to drop the matzah balls in one at a time, and then we're going to put the lid on it. You're going to turn your temperature down so that it will simmer, and whatever you do, do not open this pot for at least 30 minutes. You're going to want to. It's going to be very tempting. This will be a test of your patience. But trust me, do not open the pot. If you're worried about your soup bubbling over, the best advice I can give you is just to use your ears. If it starts to sound a little crazy in there, you're probably going to want to turn your heat down even more. But the whole point of this is while the matzah balls are simmering in the hot soup, they're also steaming a little, so you don't want to lift this lid no matter what. At least 30 minutes. Ideally, you're going to keep it shut for maybe 40 minutes or even 45 minutes. Trust me, your patience will be rewarded. So it's been about 35 minutes, so it's time. Time to lift that lid and see what we've got. Okay, 3, 2, 1. Yay, we did it! Look at our beautiful matzah balls. Now this is what you want. You want matzah balls that float because it means they're going to be nice and fluffy. So at this point, what I like to do right before I serve the soup is add some fresh new herbs. So I've got some extra dill and some extra parsley here. And this is so it adds a pop of green in our soup, because right now the herbs that we had in there from before have turned into like this yellow green color, which is fine, but sometimes we want to eat with our eyes too. Look at that color. Now that's more like it. And here is our finished, final, beautiful bowl of matzo ball soup. And there you have it. We have a pot of delicious matzo ball soup. I have a bowl of it right here that I can't wait to get into. And we have our Seder plate all set up for Passover. So I'd like to wish you all a happy Passover, Chag Sameach. I hope you have the opportunity of having a Seder with your family, friends, and loved ones. And if not, I hope you have the opportunity to carve out some time to commune with a God who loves you, who had a plan to redeem you. May you remember Yeshua, our Passover lamb. May you remember his sacrifice on the cross. Through his blood, we have deliverance, we have freedom, and through his resurrection, we have life eternal. And that is an amazing, amazing miracle. So, happy Passover, Chag Sameach, as they say, next year in Jerusalem. Bye. It's fluffy. Yes. God is really good.